We are now at the point in the college football season where every team's fate is in the hands of the College Football Playoff Committee. And tonight, the committee released their first playoff ranking of the season. At number 1, they have the Ohio State Buckeyes. At number 2, they have the LSU Tigers. At number 3, they have the Alabama Crimson Tide. At number 4, they have the Penn State Nittany Lions. And their first teams out. At number 5, they have the Clemson Tigers. And at number 6, they have the Georgia Bulldogs. And rounding out their top 10, at number 7, they have the Oregon Ducks. At number 8, they have the Utah Utes. At number 9, they have the Oklahoma Sooners. And at number 10, they have the Florida Gators, who are 7-2, the highest two-loss team in their rankings. So, my overall reaction to this first ranking is it's pretty telling on what the committee is looking at. Because you have two teams in Ohio State and LSU. Both those teams, you can have a justifiable argument on who should be the number 1 team. LSU, they have a great resume, the best resume out of anybody in the rankings. They have wins over Florida, Auburn, and Texas. Despite being unranked, it was a top 10 matchup when LSU went on the road and beat the Longhorns, which was the first big win of the season for anybody. Despite Auburn beating Oregon on a neutral site, a road win is better quality than a neutral site win. So you have LSU as far as the resume. But with Ohio State's dominance so far this season, Ohio State, they may not have as good of a resume as LSU does, but Ohio State has just dominated every single team they've played. Ohio State has only given up a total of 63 points all season, and they're winning by an average of nearly 40 points per game. So that expresses dominance. And the committee right now, they have chosen the dominance over the resume at this point. But overall, it doesn't matter that much, depending on who's where at this point, because there is still some time to go between now and the final ranking, where we determine who the 4 teams will be in the college football playoff. But the thing that I am really wondering is how come Baylor is down at number 12 despite being undefeated? If we look at who Baylor's played, they have better quality wins, in my opinion, than Utah does, than Clemson does. Arguably, maybe even Oklahoma. They have better wins than those 3 teams. At least 2 out of the 3 for sure. The third one you make an argument for. Because Baylor's beaten Iowa State, who at points has been in the top 25 when we've been working with the Associated Press process. They've beaten Oklahoma State, who's at number 23. They beat them convincingly. And they also have a win over Kansas State, who was ranked number 16 in this ranking. So I feel like Baylor should at least be in the top 9 right now. And with Utah, I get that they've been on a roll ever since their loss to USC on a Friday night. But their one loss is worse than Oklahoma's one loss. I think at least you can switch Oklahoma and Utah. Put Oklahoma at 8 and put Utah at 9. And then put Baylor over Florida and Auburn. I feel like that's at least the best way to settle it. Because Baylor's deserving of a top 9, top 10 spot. And with Minnesota at 17, it assures that despite being undefeated, they don't have the resume, that realistically, they won't have a chance at this college football playoff, even if they won out and were undefeated. Which I don't think that will happen because there's a lot of competition left for Minnesota to play. And with Baylor, if they won out, would they deserve to get in the committee's eyes? Because Iowa State could end up being in this top 25, by the end of this. Oklahoma State could still be in it. Kansas State can still be in it. Possibly Texas could get in this top 25, and if Baylor would beat them, Baylor would have wins if they won out 13-0 with the conference championship with winning the Big 12. They would have beaten Iowa State, who could be a top 25 team in their rankings by the end of the season. Oklahoma State, who could still be in this top 25. Kansas State, who could still be in this top 25. Texas, who can get into this top 25. And Oklahoma, potentially Oklahoma twice, or whoever that they've already beaten a second time. So they would have about 5 to 6 convincing wins, compared to Clemson, at the bare minimum, would only have maybe 2 wins, or even 3. So that's a huge question that I hope gets answered. So overall, I think no matter what happens, I think there's still going to be a debate, and we're still stuck with this process till, I believe, about 2024, 2026, 2027. And I think an 8-team playoff would work because it would encourage some more teams to schedule these tough non-conference opponents instead of playing Wofford or playing Charleston or playing whoever that nobody really knows. But let's go over some scenarios because this is the first ranking release of the season. So let's go over some scenarios. The first one that I want to talk about is who needs to win this showdown in Tuscaloosa on Saturday more. Does LSU need to win this matchup more, or does Alabama need to win this matchup more? Because either way, I feel like whoever loses this game is still going to have an argument to get into the college football playoff. You're just going to have to need the team that wins this matchup. If you're on the losing end of this showdown in Tuscaloosa this Saturday, you need whoever wins it to slip up at some point. So if Alabama wins this one, LSU needs Alabama to slip up against Auburn in the Iron Bowl. And if LSU wins this, then Alabama needs for LSU to slip up in one of their remaining games of the season, and their best shot could potentially be against Texas A&M, which I don't think will happen at all. And the second thing I want to talk about after we finish the LSU-Alabama one is who needs to win more between Ohio State and Penn State in a couple of weeks. But as far as this Saturday is concerned, I think Alabama needs to win this matchup more. I think if Alabama loses this one, I think it's going to be pretty tough to convince the committee to put them in the 4-team playoff, especially if we get an undefeated Ohio State, an undefeated LSU, an undefeated Clemson, and in the slight chance, an undefeated Baylor with the 5 to 6 convincing wins on their resume if Baylor happens to win out. So it's going to be pretty tough to put Alabama within those 4 teams. But I think it's possible to kick out either a Clemson or a Baylor that happens to be undefeated. If we end up with those 4 teams being undefeated, Ohio State, LSU, Clemson, Baylor, I think it's pretty easy for the committee, if they wanted to put in a 1-loss Alabama team over an undefeated Clemson, especially if Alabama only loses by a field goal. If it's an epic 55-52 game in triple overtime, I feel like it's pretty easy to put Alabama in that 4-team playoff over a Clemson team that will, at the bare minimum, have their best wins be against Texas A&M, who is a mediocre team at this point, against Wake Forest, who we don't really know what really they're capable of at this point. Wake Forest going to end up losing to Virginia Tech this weekend, and this whole Clemson thing wouldn't matter about a convincing win or not. And then whoever they beat in the ACC championship game. So it's possible that despite those 3 marquee wins, that none of them may count in the eyes of the committee. So, but I think Alabama still needs to win this matchup more, because even if LSU lost this one, and let's just say it was by a touchdown, I think a touchdown loss to Alabama, I feel like that can outweigh an undefeated Clemson or an undefeated Baylor, considering that in this first ranking, Baylor is not even in the top 10 at this point. And with Clemson being down to number 5, if they stumble against Wake Forest, or even against South Carolina on the road in the final week of the regular season, South Carolina's already beaten Georgia, so why couldn't they beat Clemson? Or if they stumbled in the ACC championship game. But I think if LSU lost, I think LSU still has the resume right now, because they have the best resume out of anybody. They've got wins against Texas, a team that can get back in this top 25, as I explained earlier, a win against Florida convincingly, and against Auburn. So they have 3 convincing wins right now, 2 wins against top 11 teams. So if Alabama wins, I feel like for LSU to get in the playoff, the best bet would be to have Georgia lose in the SEC championship game, or Florida, whoever, because Florida can still mathematically get to the SEC championship game. Maybe not necessarily theoretically, but mathematically they can. So the loser of this showdown in Tuscaloosa, they need the other one to win the SEC championship. At least I think. Either that, or hopefully they slip up and then try to gain some ground, depending on how far the team that loses falls. Because margin of victory could also be a factor. Like if the team that loses by 3 touchdowns, I think it would be much more difficult to put that one-loss team over 2 undefeated teams that the committee could think hasn't played anyone throughout the season. If it came down to an undefeated Clemson or a one-loss LSU or Alabama team, I think it'd be very difficult to put in that one-loss team if their one loss was by 3 touchdowns. If it was by 1 possession, I think it'd be a little bit easier, but by 21 points, I think that'd be a little bit too much. So the second scenario I want to talk about is who needs to win more between Ohio State and Penn State in a few weeks. I think Penn State needs to win more. Despite Ohio State being left out of the college football playoff the last 2 years, with one time they were a 2-loss Big Ten championship team, and they missed it over a 1-loss Alabama team that didn't even win their conference, didn't even win their division. And the second year, which was last year, they were left out over a 1-loss Oklahoma team, which Oklahoma avenged their 1 loss in that Big 12 championship game. So in my opinion, that nullified Oklahoma's 1 loss last year. The big reason why Ohio State's been left out of the college football playoff the last 2 seasons is because they've lost to an unranked opponent. If Ohio State were to lose to Penn State and they were able to win the Big Ten, Ohio State, I think, would get in. I think there's really no question about it. If Ohio State's 1 loss is to Penn State, and if Penn State happened to be undefeated, Ohio State lost by 3, I think the Buckeyes could get in, especially over undefeated Clemson or undefeated Baylor, once again, if they finish 13-0. So what's going to be interesting, it's going to be important to see the margin of victory in the 2 showdowns that we have coming up. One of them being this weekend and the other being about 2 to 3 weeks away. So it's very important to know the margin of victory in these. And it's also important to see how Clemson is playing. Because right now, with Clemson at this point, we're seeing kind of like what we've seen out of Florida State the first year they implemented this college football playoff format. Florida State, the defending national champions, they had several close calls. They didn't look like the best team in college football. still got to the playoff, but then when they got to the playoff, they got exposed by a team that has played much better competition than them and that looked like a way better team than them, which I think we can see the same case for Clemson if they were to make this college football playoff. But the top 7 teams, maybe even top 8 teams, arguably definitely the top 9 teams, I think teams 1 through 9. Although I'm not really sure necessarily if Oklahoma does control their own destiny at this point, I would lean towards they do, but they may need one extra team to slip up between now and when it's time to reveal the 4 teams that are going to the playoff. Ohio State, LSU, Alabama, Penn State, Clemson, Georgia, this whole top 6, they control their own destiny. Take care of your business, and you're going to be in the college football playoff. Those 6, they definitely control their own destiny. Teams 7, 8, and 9 with Oregon, Utah, and Oklahoma. I would say they control their own destiny, but they may need one team to slip up really bad. If Clemson were to slip up, that would be great for Oregon, Utah, and Oklahoma. That would be great for those 3. Because we're guaranteed to have either Ohio State or Penn State fall in a couple of weeks. And we're guaranteed to have LSU or Alabama fall. But I'm interested to see, with who loses this game, to see how far the committee drops them in the ranking. Because I want to see what they are looking for. Are they looking for margin of victory? Are they looking for head-to-head matchups? Are they looking at scores? Are they looking at how a team dominates a team? That's going to be very interesting to see throughout these next 5 to 6 weeks. So that's all I have this evening. I'm really not sure if I'm going to do these every single week. I only wanted to do this one this week because of the first one. So many teams control their own destiny. It's pretty clear that the committee, they value LSU's wins, but they don't value them enough to be number 1. It appears that they're valuing the dominance of Ohio State because they look like the most complete team in college football. But realistically, if it happened to be Ohio State and LSU right now playing for the national championship, based off what I've seen this season, I would favor Ohio State by at least 4 points. I think if Ohio State and LSU, if they're playing for national championship this Monday night, I would favor the Buckeyes by 4 points. And as far as a possible, if this were expanded, if we had a 4 and 5 playing a wild card to get that last spot, I would say Penn State would beat Clemson at this point based off what I've seen this season. I think Penn State's defense has looked dominant this year, while Clemson, they look like they've struggled a little bit at times in this season, but they've been able to recover pretty well. And with Georgia, I think that if Georgia were to win out and win the SEC, they would get in. That's another thing to look at, is if Georgia happened to win the SEC and the winner between LSU and Alabama lost to Georgia in the SEC championship game, would they still get in? So what's happening with this is you need the team that beats you, whether you're LSU or Alabama. You need that team to be undefeated, win the SEC. Because if they lost to Georgia or potentially Florida, it just completely throws a wrench in your hopes of getting to the college football playoff. So it's going to be an exciting next 5 to 6 weeks. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are as well. So take care, and I'll see you soon.